Nvidia provided me with a playtesting key for The Finals, which is a game that I've been keen to check out for its destruction, and whether or not it can finally match the chaos seen in Red Faction Guerrilla, which is the golden standard for destruction. To put it simply, The Finals destruction isn't so detailed, but you can level virtually every structure entirely, and it is done on a much larger scale. This cathedral, for instance, can be completely levelled by one person in under 10 minutes. I spent 1, 2, 3 happy games doing exactly that, much to the horror of my teammates. This one set up these skyscrapers. I didn't expect the whole thing to be destructible, but it seems like it is, at least down to the bottom playable level of it. Because this is how part of the level looked after I was done with it. It's almost like it's too much destruction because everybody ends up having to crawl over the rubble in search of objectives in the area. But of course, it isn't too much destruction, because you can never have too much. The only unbreakable things seem to be metal structures like this crane here. I think it would have been pretty easy to make those breakable, so I guess these things were done for gameplay reasons. But the rest of the environment? To dust. So the desired level of destruction is here, but things could have been broken into smaller parts, and things could have been more willing to collapse under their own weight and from resulting collisions with other things. Analysing any aspect of the destruction would be awesome if compared against any other game, but damn you, Red Faction Guerrilla. You were ahead of your time at release and still are in 2023, and the Finals still lacks all those gorgeous tiny details found in that game from 14 years ago on the PlayStation 3. Some of the collapsed pieces seem too big and cubular, but destroy a large building and a satisfying amount of the debris does remain in the level, and it can make it jolly hard to venture through a place you have previously levelled. I think my strat would be to destroy a key past the level and then to have my teammates lure the enemies into the kill zone. The game is made by X-Dice devs. Well, that's fun to say. So if this looks at all similar to Battlefield to you, then that could be why. Only in this game there's more destruction. How do they achieve so much destruction? Well, it's all done server-side, which is quite an achievement when you consider just how many parts it's trying to keep track of, once I've been let loose in it for 10 minutes. Shout out to my poor teammates, none of whom complained at all after dying and then having to spectate me back at spawn using my special abilities to charge through walls. I will say my teammates were nice. Too nice. But they couldn't be bots. Not in a completely destructible environment like this, surely. Although this guy sure does move like he's a bot. Although if you are actually a real person at Default King, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. Although you do move like a bot. Now you know me, I would never play a game to ruin it for others. So I stuck mostly to the training room, which comes with its own destructible building, which lets me test it out under controlled conditions and away from the rest of the game's community. Though even playing the game in this mode requires the game searches for players, which you wouldn't think makes any sense since you're playing it alone. I think it's more that it's searching for a server to host the destruction on. Destroying regular objects isn't something to write home about. It looks nice enough, but it's been done to death in most games already. Fences collapse in very convenient square-shaped chunks, stuff explodes or breaks after enough damage, but destroying stuff like this isn't on par with the stuff that was seen in the game Control. Blowing up trees feels distinctly Crysis-esque in how they suddenly burst into a load of leaves and twigs, but they can't be chopped up by well-placed bullets like they could have done in Crysis. But I noticed larger trees could have separate trunks blown off them, which was a nice touch. Oh, and there's fire as well, which spreads across the place, kind of like in Far Cry 2. I'm aware that I've mentioned 3 15-year-old games in this video already, but in a good way. While I'm covering this kind of stuff, I also tested the smoke grenades in the hope that they wouldn't pass through walls, but the technology still isn't there for that, it seems. I did also notice that some building decorations would stay floating in the air, which, again, I never saw with Red Faction. Some of the loose debris doesn't seem to behave like its rough, broken shape would suggest, which in this instance you can see gives it a fake, weightless kind of quality. But there are some really nice touches I found too, like when large cracks would stretch across the walls or floors or ceilings, yet the structure as a whole would remain standing, if a little creaky and angled. That stuff's nice. It feels like stuff remains solid even when it does begin to collapse, which isn't something that games always do. The frame rate on these collapsing bits is lower than the rest of the gameplay is. Sometimes it feels like 30, other bits feel more like 10. I'm not sure what dictates the frame rate of this, but some of the knock-on interactions between large scenery elements can end up feeling quite choppy. And stuff, once it is collapsed, doesn't like sitting still and occasionally shakes about or refuses to settle. But to see them trying to add this destruction as a gameplay mechanic into what's meant to be a fast-paced shooter is kind of exciting, and your character's movement system is reasonably forgiving at not getting glitched on stuff, and it's pretty easy to pull yourself up and over and under stuff. So I think the destruction in this game is more about dynamically altering the environment's shape than it is about killing people with falling stuff. So why did Nvidia send me this game's key? Well, it's because this game features several Nvidia technologies, though not as many as you might expect. There's Reflex, which makes sense in a competitive game like this, there's DLSS 3, which doesn't, and then there's only one ray traced feature, and it isn't ray traced reflections, which, given the many shiny surfaces in this game, is surprising because it's pretty easy to break the reflections right now. No, the ray traced feature in this game is global illumination, which makes a whole lot of sense given this game's dynamic destruction. Because when everything's collapsing and continually changing, it's very hard to correctly light the newly collapsed areas in real time, especially when they're only being lit by light that's bouncing off other surfaces, which itself may have already bounced off another surface, and so on. Metro Exodus benefited from this real-time lighting because of its ever-changing day-night cycle. But the Finals benefits from this even more because buildings tend to collapse faster than the sun can move across the sky, although in some games only by a bit. So that's what this ray traced lighting is doing, and if I compare it off versus on, then you can see that the game makes the brave decision to not light stuff by default. But that's only after destruction has already taken place. At the start of the level, it doesn't make much of a difference whether the global illumination is on or off. I guess because the map has pre-calculated the lighting beforehand as a fallback option for players who aren't using ray trace lighting. But now, if I blow these walls up, you can see the lighting has remained about the same as it was before without global illumination. But now when I turn ray traced global illumination on, a lot more light now bleeds further into the room from the gaps left behind from the newly destroyed walls. And the difference this lighting makes only gets greater the more that's destroyed. For instance, here, despite there being a massive hole through which light should be able to pass, no light is getting into this space. But if I turn ray traced global illumination on, it does. The reason I care about this effect is because it's something that could really have helped me a while back. So let's go back in time. Back to like 15 years ago, to Counter-Strike Source when I came up with a new idea for a map. What if this whole thing was made out of physics blocks, then got smashed to pieces by falling boulders? I know, right? Awesome. But the problem was the lighting. The game didn't have real-time lighting, so things always remained how they were lit at their starting positions. This is most evident on the falling boulders, which appear very dark because they spawned in a dark hole far above. And as these platforms begin to fall and tumble, their lighter topside remains lighter even when overturned. It isn't too much of an issue on this map because I made sure it was all well lit enough to not be a problem. And this turns out to be the same way that Red Faction Guerrilla went about this, back before ray tracing and real-time global illumination was a thing. You get away with this hack in smaller structures and when outside, but when you enter larger indoor areas, it becomes very clear that everything's glowing in a way that it shouldn't do. It looks wrong, but also less detailed than it needs to because of it. So there you have it, Red Faction Guerrilla needs ray tracing. Back to the finals, if you ask me, it's an odd decision in a competitive game to have the lighting default to black when there's no setting to light it, because this dark, unreadable environment could cause problems in a Twitch shooter, which should try to level the playing field no matter which settings are used, because a lot of people simply won't be able to use ray-traced global illumination on their systems. I mean, it could go either way. Maybe users of ray tracing have the advantage because everything is brighter, or it could be that player models glow and it makes them easier to see without the ray tracing being on. Not my problem, I'm just here to blow stuff up. I tried the low ray traced setting in the finals and it appeared to simply take longer to adjust to changes than the higher settings did. So I guess the ray trace setting is the number of rays that it shoots out every frame. Any sort of ray tracing is going to be considerably slower than none at all, so if this game does build up a competitive community, then I'm calling it now that it will be divided between people who insist on lower settings for highest frame rates and those who use the higher options if it gives them the very occasional advantage. Given how buildings take a while to collapse and for the dust to settle, I'd say that low global illumination would be a reasonable compromise to get the approximate brightness of a collapsed building right by the time the air has cleared enough to be able to view it. But what do I know? So how much of a problem is it to not have global illumination when on proper levels? Well, guess what? You've already seen it, because most of the clips at the start of this video had the ray tracing disabled. If you didn't notice, then maybe it isn't a problem. But if you did, and wondered why it was so damn dark on a sunny day, then maybe this is something that the makers of the finals should address. Knowing what I do now, I loaded the game up to blow the church up one last time. I also inspected my teammates to see if they were bots, and I can confirm they aren't because they both quickly disconnected, which isn't very bot-like because it isn't very nice. So I was on my own. And it feels like, even just in the few days I spent making this video, that the player base has got so much better, and I was under attack several times before I even reached the cathedral. But eventually I made it inside and began hammering away at the interior. The wall dash is definitely the best feature for doing this, and there's comedy potential when I get caught on some scenery and I'm just stood there on the spot screaming and failing to demolish anything. I'm unsure whether that's the building starting to collapse from the damage I've dealt, or if there's a fellow destruction enthusiast doing his bit from the outside. But here it is, the big collapse. Awesome. and an excellent chance to compare the global illumination on versus off one last time. Yep, way too dark without it on. The finals, please fix.